The Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865, was one of the greatest conflicts of ancient or modern times. Of the estimated 3.5 million men who fought in the Civil War, over 1/2 million lost their lives fighting for their country. Among the countless books written about the Civil War, one book stands apart from the rest and is still read in high schools and colleges today. That book is The Red Badge of Courage, written by American author Stephen Crane. Ironically, Crane never actually experienced the Civil War. In fact, Stephen Crane was born in 1871, 6 years after the Civil War had ended.
Cover his face. For God's sake, cover his face. With the eyes. Shut the eyes first. His eyes are staring right through me. Who is he? Why? I can't get away. None of us can get away.
Mr. Crane? Mr. Crane?
For a moment I thought you were the enemy. Who the hell are you? What are you doing up here? Why aren't you downstairs with Cora and Henry James and the cucumber sandwiches and the other freeloaders?
I'm terribly sorry to disturb you, sir, but Mrs. Crane said I might come up to interview you now. I've come from America.
Yeah, that's Cora, all right. It's just naturally lavish with everything, even with my time. Can't make her see that if I don't keep at my writing and sell some more of it soon, we're gonna be taking tea in a peddler's wagon. Well, sir, since I'm apparently not going to cough my way into the grave in the next few minutes, let's get through your questions.
Perhaps I've arrived at an awkward time. Would you care to postpone the interview?
No. Sit down. Did your editor give you any money to pay for this interview?
Well, it wasn't discussed.
Well, let's not prolong your inconvenience or mine. Besides, Cora will be embarrassed if you go away unsatisfied, and I want to avoid that. She's one of the few people in the world that actually cares about me. And that excuses lots of things.
Oh, yes, sir. I dare say it would.
Well, do you now? Are you one of those ingrates that snickers about Cora's background while wiping our food off of your chin?
Why, no, sir, but I didn't mean...
Just tell me this. Why shouldn't Cora be free to remake herself as she sees fit? Isn't the chance to be what you want to be instead of what you were one of the reasons we set off fireworks every 4th of July?
Of course, but I didn't want...
Look, if Lincoln had felt tied down by his background, he'd have passed his whole life as a storekeeper in Illinois, swapping jokes with his cronies. Come to think of it, he might have been better off if he had stayed in the store. Well, no matter, he had the choice. We Americans do like to make our own choices. Take our great guest of honor downstairs, Mr. Henry James. He hails from New York, but he now styles himself as a British gentleman more full of starch than anybody born over here. A while ago, I heard him giving Cora a lecture on the artistic sensibilities of the modern woman. When I met her, Cora was running the best bordello in Jacksonville, Florida. Imagine what she could teach him. I'm sorry I'm wandering off again. What do you want to know?
Actually, sir, I'm very interested in what you were just saying. Do you believe Americans are successful because they can be whatever they want to be?
Most Americans try to remake themselves all the time. I'm not sure if any of them ever succeed.
Mr. Crane, I don't understand. A moment ago you said Lincoln and Henry
It's
James...
frightening, really. I mean, they say the next century will be the American century. But what if we're all chasing a fool's dream? I mean, what if the world isn't as pliable as we think it is? I mean, can we really grow into the parts we dream up for ourselves, or will they always be too cramped or too loose like a country boy's store-bought clothes?
What you're saying is really astonishing, Mr. Crane.
Astonishing. Why?
Well, it just seems to contradict your own life. What you've been able to do yourself.
Contradictions surprise you? Well,
My name is Michael.
Well, Michael, the more you ply your trade, the more you'll find that everybody's life is full of contradictions. In real life, as opposed to books, people don't follow one clear direction. They stagger and stumble every which way. Because in their minds, they're driven by a confusion of voices. Regular Tower of Babel. It's pretty good. Why on earth am I telling it to you? I ought to save it for my own stuff. So now ask me what I think of the British literary scene, or about the way my books are received over here, or whatever it is that your editor told you to ask.
You said everyone listens to a Tower of Babel. What's the first voice you remember hearing?
First voice I remember was the one I never paid much attention to. My father's. My brothers and sisters, we must be ever on our guard. In this godless world around us, there are so many traps and snares threatening us. So many evils clutching at our souls, trying to drag them down to fiery perdition. Dancing, trashy novels, smoking cards, and most dangerous of all, demon rum. Preaching like that was enough to scare anybody. I had to do something to stop the shakes. I heard a lot of that kind of thing at the Methodist summer camp over in Ocean Grove, New Jersey on the shore. Father used to preach for them every season. And after he died, my mother and the family used to spend our summers there. They were good, kindly people, my folks. But the religion? Well, it never stuck very well on me. Of course, I was never very bothered by my lack of faith.
Why not, sir?
Because I already knew what I wanted to do with my life. One day I was the youngest reporter at a speech by Hamlin Garland at the Avon by the Sea Assembly. It was right after he published the Main Traveled Road stories. Here. This is what he looked like back then. Anyway, I'll never forget what he said. The art of the future must reflect the immense variety of color and movement in the broad national scene. In the big cities, and the slums, the remote prairies. Garland made me think of a writer's dream. I could roam all over this bursting country and find words to match and capture everything that I saw. No, not just what I saw, but the way I saw it. The way it made me feel. Well, that has been my gold fever, and it's chased me from one end of the globe to the other. Well, Michael, you must have enough now for 2 articles. When I was a reporter, I often made do with far less.
I'm afraid I don't have as much imagination as you do, Mr. Crane. I have to rely on my sources for color and excitement. So if you don't mind, could I keep on digging for a little while?
Well, you're clever enough to be a good reporter. Give you that. What else do you want to know?
When you left New Jersey, where did you go first?
New York City?
And when you think of New York now, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
A big brownstone building called the Pendennis Club. A warren of little rooms crowded with medical students and artists, and, oh yes, a big black pot-bellied stove that never worked very well. You know, I didn't mind where my housemate sat on a stack of unsold copies of Maggie Girl of the Streets, my first novel. I mean, after all, it was a rather boyish attempt to be realistic about the effects of slum life. But when I caught them putting books in the stove, that was too much. Of course, I can still remember it being so cold I was ready to burn the whole damn stack myself.
Who was the most significant person you met in New York?
Oh, Corwin Linson, without a doubt.
He was a journalist too?
Oh, he was and is a journalist, illustrator, painter extraordinaire, critic, connoisseur of culture, entrepreneur, a very patient instructor of the ignorant.
Sir?
Well, he not only let this bumpkin camp out on his couch for weeks at a time, he also took the trouble to tell him what was really going on in the world. About the art for art's sake movement, impressionist painting. About so many things I was too provincial to discover for myself. Yes, it's called a hookah. Would you like to try it?
Oh, well, I don't want to trouble you.
Go ahead. You'll enjoy it. We have tobacco. No, that's too tame. Oh, a little opium would be just the thing now, wouldn't it? I mean, that is what you expect, isn't it? Everyone knows that I frequent opium dens. I experiment with even darker, more heinous evils, as a romantic Satanist should. After all, I have to be faithful to the tradition of desperate, depraved rebels, don't I? Oh, where Blake and Byron and Beardsley have gone, I must follow. And oh, my friend, I do. You see, to satisfy my lust for intimate knowledge of sin, I made Faust's bargain. I pledged my allegiance to the sable angel, to Lucifer! Pretty frightening, huh? Maybe just plain ridiculous. But that's what they still say about me. You know who started those rumors? My fellow reporters. My brothers in journalism. Of course, I never tried to shake that label. Because to tell the truth, a part of it anyway, I enjoy the irony. Me, the minister's son, raised in the bosom of the Methodists, a Satanist. But I don't yet understand why the people I've worked with for years would spread such a story. Oh, I've been told often enough why the regulars don't like me. Editors have sat me down in their offices and given me their "let me tell you the facts of life, kid" lecture. It goes like this. Look, Crane, you gotta understand this business. If our competition runs headlines this big, we gotta run bigger ones. And if the news isn't big enough for headlines this size, well, our ace reporters,
they take care of that. They make the news as big as we need it to be. So you see, star reporters are very important. They get bylines, and they make big names. But they work like herd dogs, chasing all over the globe, slashing through the worst weather, sleeping with cockroaches, dodging bullets. And then they see you drift in, stumble into some good stories, get yourself in the headlines, and then drift off again to write your novels and your poems. They're jealous, for God's sake. And besides, they say you look down your nose at regular reporters. Well, are they right, Crane? Are you that kind of a stuck-up bastard? The truth is, I'm uncomfortable sometimes with regular reporters because I have trouble doing what they do so well. I mean, they can always crank out something to beat their deadlines, but half the time I can't do that. What I see has to stay in my head for a while. I have to let my imagination work on it. I mean, half the time I don't even know when it'll be ready for me to write it down. Well, take Red Badge, for example. I mean, I did my research. I read lots of reports in Century and other magazines by veterans, and they reminded me of the tales that I had heard from old soldiers I had spoken to, but damned if those eyewitness accounts weren't just frustrating. I mean, they set down what they saw and what they did, flat and dry, but they didn't give me the mental details. I mean, what did the sky look like that day? What colors seemed to pierce the smoke? What did they think about when they were being shot at? What do you feel when you're running across a field at men who are determined to kill you before you kill them? And those are the kinds of things I wanted to know, but there was no one to tell me. So I had to let my imagination sink into what I did know until the images formed clearly somehow and I could set them down.
Oh yes, the images. I'm glad you brought that up. There's a famous image in Red Badge, a terrible one really, that I wanted to ask you about. I copied it out. Ah, here it is. At length he reached a place where the high arching boughs made a chapel. He softly pushed the green doors aside and entered. Pine needles were a gentle brown carpet. There was a religious half-light. Near the threshold, he stopped, horror-stricken at the sight of a thing. He was being looked at by a dead man who was seated with his back against a column-like tree. The corpse was dressed in a uniform that had once been blue, but was now faded to a melancholy shade of green. The eyes, staring at the youth, had changed to the dull hue to be seen on the side of a dead fish. The mouth was opened. Its red had changed to an appalling yellow. Over the gray skin of the face ran little ants. Did that image just come from your imagination, Mr. Crane?
Yes, from my imagination. From my curse.
Imagination is a curse? How could a writer say that?
You'd say the same thing anyone would if the faces of dead men, of dying men, kept springing up everywhere to mock at you, to grab at you.
I'm sorry, sir. My question was meant to be aesthetic. I didn't realize it would be so personally disturbing.
I'm not offended, Michael. What disturbs me isn't personal. It lies in wait for you, too.
What? Do you mean death? Is death the enemy? When I first came in, you said you thought I was the enemy. Were you talking about death?
No. Death is just what happens when the enemy wins again. What I'm talking about is a presence that's much more malicious. I don't know what to name it, but there are times when I feel it as sure as my heartbeat.
Mr. Crane, I don't understand. When do you feel this
presence.
Look, it's not a symptom like heartburn, for God's sake. I can't predict when I feel it. It can happen anywhere. Like that coal mine in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
What were you doing in a coal mine in Scranton?
McClure magazine sent Corwin and me there to do a story on what it was like to be a miner. You know, looking back on it now, it seems like the whole trip seemed to point toward a dark epiphany. Mine was in a section called Dunmore. And when we got there, it was like exploring a strange, new blasted world. The breakers, the huge buildings where the coal is processed, squatted on the hillsides and in the valleys like enormous preying monsters. They seem to eat the leaves, the grass, the sunshine even, and leave everything looking gray and lifeless. On our way to the entrance to the shaft, we watched full coal cars inch up an inclined cable road to the top of the breaker. We could see the workers up there dump raw coal into the shaft, and then it would roar down through the breaker while huge, clanking metal jaws ground up the chunks, and breaker boys sitting alongside of the chute grabbed out hunks of slate as this black river poured by. Those boys were the most bizarre and chilling part of the scene. They were just small children. So young you'd expect them to be learning their multiplication tables in school or playing tag at recess. And there they were, black as infernal imps, playing baseball on top of comb heaps during the few minutes they had to eat their meals. Inside the mine was a dark, swirling chaos. If a man survives the gas, the floods, the squeezes of falling rocks, the cars shooting through the little tunnels, he succumbs to an attack of miner's asthma that racks and shakes him into the grave. Meanwhile, he gets paid $2 a day. As I climbed aboard the elevator to return to the surface, I couldn't help but think about the engineer sitting far above us in his engine room, with his hand upon the lever that could pull us out of that infernal hell. I wondered, what does he think of us? Does he ever think of us? His unseen dependents. Soon the fleeting black walls were flecked with light, and the flecks became a downpour of sunbeams. The high sun floated once again in a splendor of spotless blue, and the distant mountains were dressed in purple and stood like monarchs. That glory in the distance kept tugging at my imagination, drawing me westward, just as whole generations of Americans have been captivated, pushed toward the frontier.
You went west yourself, didn't you?
Yes, in 1895 as a correspondent for the Bachelor News Syndicate.
And what happened to you out there? I mean, were the pioneers right? Did you feel you had escaped from the grip of determinism or the enemy you were talking about?
No, not really.
You know, I'm surprised, or should I say disappointed, to hear you say that. I mean, look at that. I've never been west myself, but I've read that you've been to parts of the country that still look the way Remington saw it, full of danger and freedom. Is it really like that?
Michael, as soon as I crossed the Mississippi, I began to learn that there are two American Wests. The real West is a place dominated by nature's raw power. Out there, the prairies sweep beyond the reach of the eye, the mountains dwarf everything human. The endless winds can turn the prairie into a naked brown Sahara in the summer and an icy tomb in winter. People that live in the West often spend their lives trying to shelter themselves from nature.
or to blunt its raw power. Then there's the West that we all carry in our imagination. We read the dime novels, we go to the Wild West shows, and we look at Remington's statues and paintings. They give us our own American myth, an ideal version of where we came from and who we are. That version exists only in remnants now. Oh, like the ruins of the old missions in the Alamo. But it doesn't disturb the image. Oh, we all like to sit tall in the saddle, don't we?
Yes, sir, I guess we do.
Yeah, maybe that's why when I finally did stumble into a real old-fashioned Wild West adventure down in Mexico, I had the feeling that I had somehow become a part of that legend. I had this Mexican guide, Jose, and he and I were spending the night in an isolated adobe inn. Fire had just burned down to embers we had dozed off, and a harsh voice shattered that sleep. "You, gringo! Give me all your money or I will kill you where you lie." I pulled myself up on my elbows and blinked my eyes until I could see Ramon. He was the image of a bandit come to life. Big sombrero, big mustache, big belly under the gun belt, and his pistol was pointed right at me. It began to frustrate him that I just stared and kept silent. And from the other room, I heard a burst of murmured masculine and feminine voices. Some giggling, a few chords of guitar music. And then a woman called out Ramon's name. Her voice. Oh, her voice was alluring and impatient. Finally, lust won out over greed. After warning me to stay put, Ramon ducked under the blanket covering the entrance to the other room. As the shadows began to lighten, Jose and I tried to make our escape. And our luck held. We slipped outside and walked the horses away from the inn. Once we were well beyond the tiny village, we kicked them into a gallop and flew off into the desert, still afraid that we might be pursued and killed. That fear was not misplaced. Because Jose's horse ran out of steam and began to slow down, the bandits were soon gaining on us. And for the second time in the last few hours, I thought we were dead men. Until, that is, we swept over the crest of a little hill and down into the welcoming ranks of a company of rurales, the Mexican equivalent of the cavalry that were on patrol in the area. Meanwhile, Ramon was thundering closer, sure that he would have us and my fortune in his grasp in the next few minutes, until, that is, he and his men reached the top of that hill. Well, for the next 20 seconds, Ramon and his gang were like tobogganers that had started down a hill and changed their mind but not their direction. They succeeded only in sliding to the bottom of the hill and coming to a panicky stop. Then the commander of the rurales hops off of his horse, marches over to where Ramon sits cowering in his saddle, and proceeds to scream hair-raisingly eloquent abuse at him in very rapid Spanish. Finally, the commander kicked Ramon's horse as hard as he could. The poor animal reared up, nearly throwing Ramon completely, and then galloped up the hill, dragging Ramon along with him while the rest of his gang straggled after them.
You know, I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but I feel as if we ought to start applauding now.
Oh, don't apologize. I felt the same way at the time, as if I'd just seen the end of a show.
Yep, that's the way Westerns go. A hero, a villain, lots of action, some comedy, and a happy ending. But you know, Mr. Crane, your Western stories twist the formula upside down, or inside out. till you can't tell the good guys from the bad guys. Doesn't that frustrate some of your traditional readers?
Oh, I'm sure that it does. But life does that to all of us, doesn't it?
Mr. Crane, do you want some brandy? Some water?
No cigarette. I just need a cigarette.
A cigarette?
That's better. I'll take that drink now if you don't mind. Thank you.
Well, if you're comfortable now, perhaps I better leave you to your rest. I've tired you when you're not feeling well.
No, don't leave. Sit down next to me there for a while. I find that it helps if I keep my mind working on something else when these spells come. Go ahead with your questions. They're a good distraction.
Of course. Once I know my mission, I'm happy to accept it. Let's see now. You had some exciting adventures out west, but you didn't find the freedom or escape from the enemy you were looking for. How did you react? Were you disappointed? Depressed?
Strangely enough, neither. True, people in general do not seem any less caught or controlled out there. But I had been facing what ought to have been my death, and it didn't happen. I thought, maybe my particular fate has not been plotted out and set down yet. Maybe I still have some room to maneuver. In fact, that impression was reinforced the next year off the coast of Florida. I set sail the day before New Year's Day, 1897, out of Jacksonville aboard the Commodore, which was going to deliver guns and supplies to the Cuban rebels fighting the Spanish masters, and I was going to report what happened. I was looking forward to one kind of adventure and got quite another.
Oh yes, I read little about this episode. Tell me, before such things happen, do people really have premonitions of disaster, strange foresights, and so forth, the way newspaper stories tell us?
Well, I didn't, I know that. I was actually asleep in the pilot house that night when the chief engineer rushed in to tell the captain about trouble in the engine room. From that moment on, everything seemed slightly unreal, as if I was half asleep and half awake. Dreamlike images come back to me. Bailing in the engine room, a sweaty hell. All churning soapy water and clanking machinery. Jumping into the 10-foot dinghy while it was being lowered over the side, the oiler and the captain with his arm in a sling jumping in after me. The hours we spent tethered by a long rope to the dying Commodore, staring at its fitful lights, only thing visible on the dark sea. He seemed to be sliding through a nightmare that still might evaporate at any moment. Early the next morning, though, that air of unreality was shattered. We were surrounded by a cold, dark gray fog. We were quite close to the Commodore again. We could see that it was only moments away from sliding permanently under the waves. The real shock was the sight of 7 men still standing on the deck, which was listing at a 45-degree angle. Why hadn't they gotten into one of the boats? Why were they just standing there? We could see that we couldn't get close enough to be of any help, so finally, one by one, they just slid into the frothing water. I can still see the way the first mate threw his hands over his head and dropped over the rail to his death. Anger in his clenched fists, unspeakable rage on his face. The way his eyes locked onto mine are burned into my memory. We dropped the tether line. None us knew the color of the sky. Our eyes were fastened only on the waves that swept toward us. They were the color of slate, except for the tops, which were foaming white. And as each wave swept toward us, the dinghy was like a horse galloping toward an outrageously high fence. Would buck and scramble to the very top, leap into the air out of the foam, and then scornfully bump over the crest and slide and race and splash down a long incline, only to arrive bobbing and nodding right in front of the next slaty wall of water. As the sun climbed higher, we were eager to reach the crests of the waves so we could squint desperately at the swaying horizon. Finally, we all saw something stationary on the horizon that seemed like the point of a pin. Slowly, so slowly, the lighthouse grew larger. After an eternity, it almost acquired color and rested on the water like a gray upright shadow. And then the land began to emerge so beautifully to us. From a black line, it became a line of black and white, of trees and sand. And at last the captain said that he could make out a house. Now we were sure that the lighthouse keeper would see us, and soon the life-saving boat would be coming out to meet us as we rode the booming surf in as far as we could. But the moments dragged on, and we saw no activity on the shore. So we got more and more nervous, and then angry. How could those people be so blind, so cowardly? What we feared more than anything else seemed more and more likely to happen. We were going to spend another night on that little boat. Wind grew colder, and we started to shiver again. And at that moment, our anger rose. If I am going to be drowned, why in the name of the 7 mad gods that rule the sea was I allowed to come thus far and contemplate sand and trees? That only any woman fate cannot mean to drown me now. She dare not drown me now. A night on the open sea in a small boat seems endless. In the morning, we realized we couldn't wait any longer for help that wasn't coming. We were going to have to try to make a run through the surf despite the risk. The oiler was at the oars, and he turned the boat around, and we began to back in toward the shore. The dinghy miraculously navigated one possibly steep comber, and then the next crest crashed over us. A boiling flood of white water caught the boat and whirled it almost perpendicular. But somehow we didn't sink. And then the third wave came at us, huge, furious, implacable. It swallowed the boat. And almost simultaneously, we all tumbled into the sea. When I reached the surface, we all set about swimming toward the shore. And for a moment or two, I could see that I was making progress. And then a current caught me, and no matter how hard I stroked, I couldn't seem to move forward. Then I looked to the right, and I saw a man running along the beach. He was taking off his clothes with most remarkable speed. Coat, shirt, trousers, everything flew magically off of him. And then a huge wave caught me and threw me forward easily and with great speed. And it struck me, even as I was flying through the air, that this was a miracle of gymnastics. I landed in water that wasn't even up to my waist, but I couldn't stand up. Each wave knocked me flat, and the undertow held me fast. And then the man that was running and undressing and undressing and running, he bounded into the water, naked as a tree in winter. But he seemed to have a halo around his head as he pulled on my arm and dragged me toward the beach. As I lay there on the sand, I realized, as if in a slow dawning, that if the 7 mad gods
or nature or whoever, if they hardly notice us, if we don't matter any more than the driftwood on the beach, then maybe sometimes we can slip through on our own to what we want. Some of us might write our own stories and make them happen. Just maybe.
Oh, good gracious. Excuse me, sirs. Mrs. Crane thought you might be wanting some tea.
Why don't I sit it down here?
Thank you, Mary. Mary, you look a little askew.
Oh, bless me, sir. I tripped over a broomstick out there in the hall. Gave me such a turn. Will that be all, sir?
Yes, thank you, Mary. Oh, and Mary,
Yes, sir.
before long we'll have you taking these hurdles like a steeplechaser.
Oh, sir. Such a
You know, I saw that broomstick when I first came in. It was decorated most unusually. I meant to ask you about that.
It was a prop in a party game we were playing last night. H.G. Wells thought it up. Brooms became horses and we all went hopping down the hall. Can you imagine Henry James bouncing along on a broomstick?
That is unbelievable. How did you get someone like him to do something like that?
Cora, who else? Her imagination and her nerve are contagious, even for eminent men and women. She's never paid much attention to odds or obstacles, or to caution and prudence for that matter. Hallelujah for her. She sees what she wants and she reaches out for it, never mind the cost or the risk. I think of it. A few years back, she was a girl on the fringes of New York high society, feeling frustrated and neglected as the wife of an aristocratic British playboy. So, one day she gets up and walks out. Just pays no attention to what polite society says about women that leave their husbands and sail off for Florida, board a millionaire's yacht, and then jump ship in Jacksonville to ride in a sporting house. She says that men are basically free to live the way they want. She feels that women should be able to do the same. Now, I can name a lot of women that dare to say things like that, but I know of very few others that actually dare to live that way. I remember after they fished me out of the Atlantic, I got the chance to go to Greece to report on a real war, the one between the Turks and the Greeks. Well, Cora didn't hesitate for a minute. She had an ambition to be the country's first female war correspondent, so, propriety be damned, off we went together. After Greece, we wound up in England, decided to settle in for a while. I liked it over here right away. Of course, you have to get used to the British, though. Nothing quite so intimidating as a well-educated Englishman. And if you face a gang of them at one of those infernal receptions, oh, you better be ready to defend yourself. The interrogations usually go this way. No, I haven't consciously imitated de Maupassant. How much did Red Badge earn? Is that really relevant to... No, I wouldn't say I belong to Zola's group. I don't even know much about the man. Yes, but I don't want to be known exclusively as a war novelist. How much was the size of my last advance? You gentlemen are like flies in summertime. Why don't you go find a horse's ass? I learned that you can instill a little healthy fear into any English crowd if they think you're a rough, tough American cowboy type. Well, after I made these adjustments, I found that Cora and I could live quite comfortably in the English countryside. I could even write well over here, about America.
It's fascinating to hear you say that. I mean, it's becoming so typical. Mark Twain's been living here and in Germany for several years now, and Bret Harte's been living in London for a long time. Are American writers naturally far-sighted or something?
You could put it that way. Or maybe we just need to put some distance between ourselves and our countries so we can sort out our feelings for America from the reality of it. Anyway, about a year ago, everything in my life seemed just about right. I had friends that I could trust. beautiful, fascinating woman that was devoted to me. I was doing the work that I liked, and people were liking it. Some of them were even calling me a genius. I was living more comfortably than I ever dreamed of doing. One day I said to myself, could it be that I am walking around right now and my best daydream come true? Is this the way it happens? Do you look up all of a sudden and find that you don't have to scramble and search and chase anymore because you've gotten to where you want to be? Do you say to yourself, never mind the doubts and the black moments that still come and the day-to-day worries. This is success. I am a successful American. All I have to do is believe it. As unlikely as it seems, I have beaten the odds. For a while there, I felt like I was back in Cora's place in Jacksonville playing cards with whatever deals us the things we face, and I was turning up winners. Yes, I sold 2 more stories. Cora and I can live happily here, and the Blue Noses will mostly look the other way. The British and American critics are giving me more and more respect. And then I got the feeling I always get when I get lucky at cards. This is unnatural. They're not going to let me go on like this. Sure enough, bill collectors, not enough money. I realize I don't want to be in exile for the rest of my life. And I do have some conventional longings after all, for marriage and children and such. But how will they ever be possible for Cora and me? More coughing spells, a spot of blood on my handkerchief. I wonder if I hadn't looked so suspiciously at my good fortune, it might have lasted longer.
Yes, I have the same feeling. But I can't help searching for cracks and flaws and dark undersides either. Maybe none of us can.
Even when the sun is golden and warm, I turn in my mind to face the night. And sure enough, the headlines soon proclaim that night.
Headlines?
Congress declares war against Spain. President McKinley calls for 125,000 volunteers. Got to Cuba as quickly as I could. I borrowed money from friends. I bothered important people. I even tried to enlist. Finally, the New York World agreed to send me along with the invading troops as a correspondent. It was as if something was compelling me to be there. It wasn't as if I had any illusions about the war. I knew the way the system worked. I knew that the newspapers had manufactured this crisis and that our dispatches would create heroes and villains and great victories and terrible disasters regardless of what really happened. But still, I felt as if I was on my way to some kind of appointment I couldn't avoid. Maybe that's why I envy Theodore Roosevelt. Hey, there he was, swaggering around the mountains below Santiago, absolutely bursting with satisfaction. Everything was bully. He had his aim and his eyes fixed right on a bright destiny, and he was riding straight toward it. I was moving towards something inexorable, too. But I could only fear what it was until that moment when I was trudging along the San Juan Trail with some of our troops, and I almost walked into a body stretched right across the trail. At first, all I could see was the obscenely gaping hole in his chest and the spreading stain of blood around it. But then a familiar voice said, "Well, they got me." That man lying there, the life oozing out of him, was Reuben McNabb, a classmate of mine. I suddenly felt an overwhelming need to look away from his face, to run from the grip of those terrible eyes. Because in a flash I recognized them for what they were. few minutes later, I was lying next to Colonel Wood and Richard Harding Davis, the correspondent, behind an embankment. Our unit was pinned down by Spanish sniper fire. Suddenly, I stood up so the snipers could see me. Bullets whizzed by my head. Colonel Wood shouted at me to drop down again, but I was frozen there. Then Davis yelled out sardonically, "You're not impressing anybody by doing that, Crane." Well, I had to smile at that, so I crouched down out of sight, and the confrontation was postponed for the moment. Oh, I was feverish at the time, worn out and sick, and that's how some of my friends explained what I did. But there was more to it than that. When I looked into Reuben McNabb's eyes, a realization spread like a stain across my consciousness, and it has remained with me ever since. Fate will always blot out our stories before we've finished living them. We'll be cut off in mid-sentence no matter what we do. That's the final answer to my hopes and struggles for independence, and the oh-so-American freedom shaped the pattern of my life and my world. It's the casually mocking sentence uttered by that black wall in the coal mine in Pennsylvania, by the winds on the Nebraska plain, by the furious ocean in the serene lighthouse, and by all those dead men's eyes. And from that moment on, I seemed to meet that answer around every corner.
Mr. Crane, Stephen, if this is what you've learned after all your travels and all you've done, and it's with you all the time, how do you get past the despair?
I don't get past it. But I'm not limited by it. You see, if I stand here and shake my fist at the universe, it's an empty gesture that has no power, no echoes. But if I put my rage on paper, and you read it, and other people read it years from now, then my voice will stay alive. What I've seen, what I've felt, will keep going. The battle will continue.